afternoon. Good. Okay. Okay, let me start. My name is Sunyoung Lee. I'm chair of English department at Cyber-Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you for coming to COPS and AU Open TESOL Seminar. I'd like to welcome all of you, guests, students, faculty, and staff. Here we have professors, students, and staff from 애너하임 University TESOL MA program. We also have faculty and students from Hanguk University of Foreign Studies TESOL programs, and as well as the students from English department at HOPS. We also have students, faculty, and staff from Cyber-Hanguk University of Foreign Studies, as well as guests from other institutions. Welcome all of you, and thank you for coming to this Open TESOL Seminar. Today, I'm very honored and privileged to introduce to you three, not just one, world-renowned scholars here at our campus. As you may all expect, we cannot introduce them without mentioning their great achievements and accomplishments throughout their careers. First, let me introduce Dr. David Noonan. Dr. David Noonan is currently Vice President for Academic Affairs at Änohaim University. He is the founding dean of the Änohaim University Graduate School of Education and served as president of Änohaim University from 2006 to 2008. Dr. Noonan is a world-renowned linguist and best-selling author of English language teaching textbooks for Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, and Thomson Learning. His ELT textbook series, Go For It, is the largest-selling textbook series in the world, with total sales exceeding 1 billion. In 2000, David Noonan served as president of TESOL, the world's largest language teaching association, and was the first person to serve as president from outside North America. Dr. David Noonan has served as chair and professor of applied linguistics at the University of Hong Kong since 1994, and has been involved in the teaching of graduate programs for such prestigious institutions as Columbia University, the University of Hawaii, Montreal Institute for International Studies, and many more. Okay. Next, let me introduce Dr. Andy Curtis. His PhD in International Education and MA in Applied Linguistics from the University of York, a postgraduate diploma in TESOL from Sheffield Hallam University, and his teaching degree from Sunderland University. Dr. Curtis has taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and Queen's University in Canada, and the School for International Training in the US. As an invited speaker, workshop facilitator, and consultant, Dr. Curtis has given approximately 100 presentations and worked with 10,000 language teachers in more than 20 countries, including Brazil, Canada, China, Colombia, Costa Rica, Hong Kong, etc. And finally, let me introduce Dr. Ken Beatty. Dr. Ken Beatty taught the last 15 years at universities in the UAE, the People's Republic of China, and Hong Kong. And Dr. Beatty is the author and co-author of more than 100 textbooks for Pearson, Longman, Oxford University Press, Thomson, Heinlein, and Hong Kong Educational Press. And although most of these focus on various aspects of English as a second language, he also writes and reviews on the topic of CALL, that is Computer-Assisted Language Learning. He is involved in electronic media and was academic advisor to Hong Kong's educational television from 1998 to 2004. Dr. Beatty holds a PhD in curriculum studies from the University of Hong Kong. Please welcome Dr. Noonan, Dr. Curtis, and Dr. Beatty.
Thank you very much. With that wonderful introduction, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. What we want to do this afternoon is to explore some of the implications of the emergence of English as a global language, and I think the implications are fairly significant. I've recently been involved in a number of projects. Most recently, the establishment of the English Language Institute of Singapore, which has been established by the Singaporean government to monitor standards of English, to promote the concept of standard English, and to try and discourage people in Singapore from using the vernacular, which is known as Singlish. And I want to look at some of these implications, but also challenge some of the notions that are inherent in this notion of we must speak proper English. Okay? And I'm going to suggest that the notion of trying to adhere to or striving for native speaker competence of one particular variety of English or another variety of English is not only impossible, but is also wrong-headed. That the standards we should be looking towards are those of the development and promotion of acceptable standards of international English. And I will, during the course of my presentation, I will articulate and spell out for you and give examples of what I consider to be some of the criteria that I think we need to take into consideration when we're judging the effectiveness of the language that we use. Okay? Am I speaking too quickly? You can all understand me? Am I speaking an acceptable standard of international English? I'll leave Dr. Beattie to answer that question when he speaks. Some of the questions then that I want to look at this afternoon include, what do we mean by standard language? What are language standards? In the context of standard language and language standards, why is language variation important? I also want to take a little step back and look at the evolution of English as a global language, looking at the question of how and why did English emerge as the global language. Also, who uses English today? And as I said, towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to address this question of what criteria should we draw on in establishing standard languages and language standards. And what are the implications of all this for countries such as Singapore, which is and other countries in the region, which is trying to promote a particular view of what is appropriate in terms of the language which is used by its citizen. And again, I think the implications of what I have to say should also be relevant to the Korean situation, and to not only to the teaching and promotion of English, but also the teaching and promotion of other languages. Here on this campus, you teach many. How many languages do you teach on this campus? Around 40. Okay. So again, I think the question is a relevant one. What is it that as you teach these languages, what is the standard to which you aspire for your students? What are the criteria that your students should draw on when deciding, well, yes, my Chinese or my Korean or my Japanese or whatever language, yes, it is an acceptable international standard. What is that standard? What are the criteria? What does an acceptable standard of international Korean, for example, what does it look like for a Canadian or an Australian or a Japanese or an American who comes here to study Korean or one of the other languages that you teach? Jennifer Jenkins, in her important book that was published not so long ago, says standard language is the term used for the variety of language which is considered to be the norm. Okay? It is the variety held up as the optimum for educational purposes and used as a yardstick against which other varieties of language are measured. Okay? And one of the issues that has been investigated and debated by linguists who are interested in this issue is do we just talk about for example, in relation to English, do we just talk about a standard English, or do we talk about standard British English, standard American English, standard Californian English? No such thing. Standard Canadian English, standard Australian English, and so on, or do we just talk about standard English? And one of the trends has been a move away from referring to standard British English, standard American English, and standard Australian English, and so on, towards the notion of standard acceptable, standard international English. So language standards, on the other hand, so a standard language is one that's considered to be the norm, and then variations, and I'm going to talk about variation in a moment, variations are movements away from that standard language. Language standards are rules to which someone wishing to attain the status of a speaker of a standard language must conform, okay? So it's prescriptive, it is not descriptive. Although, of course, these rules can and do change over time, okay? Of course, if languages didn't vary, then there would be no need to talk about language standards because we'd all be speaking exactly the same language. But of course, languages do vary. They vary in a number of important ways. First of all, they vary in terms of accent, okay? And when we use the word, when we talk about accents, we're talking about variations in pronunciation, okay? We're focusing on pronunciation. You will hear this afternoon 3 different variations of accent. You'll hear my extremely polished and sophisticated Australian accent. You'll hear Dr. Beattie's rather rustic Canadian accent, and then you'll hear Dr. Curtis's extremely rustic British English. So when we talk about accent, we talk about variations in pronunciation. And among native speakers, accents reflect geographical and socio-economic differences. I can't remember the exact quote, but I think it was from the George Bernard Shaw play Pygmalion, where he says that every time an Englishman opens his mouth, or her mouth, another Englishman despises him, okay? People make judgments about your intelligence, your income levels, and the state of your wardrobe based on your accent in the United Kingdom and also in other places as well. I found it very interesting when I was doing graduate study in England, and I travelled around and lived in different parts of England, and it was quite remarkable how even in this day and age with technology and the movement of people, how different regional accents, you could go from one village to the next and the accents would be different. And it's quite remarkable. People identify with their accent, and very often they work very hard to retain their accent because it's a marker of identity, it's a marker of solidarity, and I think it's very, very important for people in terms of their identity, who they are. I have a number of accents, and so somebody once asked Dr. Beattie, well, who is Professor Noonan? You know, he's got all these different accents and different identities, and Professor Beattie said, oh, he's a great bunch of people. So when I grew up in a mining town in the middle of the Australian desert, right, the middle of the desert, and if I went into that mining town and went into a bar and I started speaking the way that I'm speaking now, people would look at me as though I was a little bit strange. So I'd have to change my accent, okay? I'd have to go into the bar and say, how you going, mate, all right? Yeah, sure, pretty good. I haven't seen you around for a while, yeah. Yeah, I know, I haven't been here for a few years, yeah. So how you going, all right? Yeah, we're going all right, yeah, pretty good, yeah. That's good. Like a beer? Yeah, love a beer. Love a couple, actually. Okay. So that, and again, one of the points I'm going to make later on is that the mark of an educated person is a person who can adapt their styles of speaking, their pronunciation, and their registers to, in terms of appropriacy for different situations and different circumstances. So, as I said, among native speakers, different accents reflect differences of geography, but also differences of socio-economic status. In non-native speakers of English, accents usually reflect features of the speaker's first language, particularly if you started learning English after puberty, and I'm not going to go into the research evidence on this, but don't be worried. I think Korean English is very, very cute, okay? So you embrace it. Another type of variation is dialects, and dialects differ in terms of their grammar and their vocabulary. Again, they reflect geographical and socio-economic differences, all right? And again, in the mining town where I grew up, in the middle of the Australian desert, there were certain differences of vocabulary and certain differences of grammar from the standard English, standard Australian English. So, for example, in fact, our dialect was more sophisticated. Okay, it was more sophisticated. You know what that language I just spoke there? Am I right? Yeah, all right, okay. It doesn't sound sophisticated, does it? But it's more sophisticated in some of its grammar. For example, in that dialect that I used when I was a child, we marked second person for plurality. Okay? In standard English, for singular, we say you, right? For plural, we say you. Okay, so in standard English, second person is not marked for plurality. But in my dialect, it is. So one person is you, more than one person is yous. Now, yous are not sheep. Well, they are, but... So this is a sophistication, because I can actually indicate to you if I'm talking about one person or more than one person, right? But my mother, who aspired to be upwardly mobile, she wanted us to speak the standard English, and so whenever we kids used the word use, she would correct us. She would say, don't say use, say you. Okay? Don't say use. It shows that you'll come from working background, working class. And so later on, when I started to study linguistics, I said, but Mum, the use of use is more sophisticated. And she said, I don't care, just don't use it. But it can. There are occasions, I've been in situations, there are occasions where the use of you for both singular and plural causes confusion and causes miscommunication. If I'm in a gathering and I want to invite a certain person out for dinner, and I say within the earshot of a number of people that I've been chatting with, would you like to come to dinner? Then people are not sure whether I'm just talking about one person or everybody. But if I were able to use then I would be able to I'd be able to indicate that I wanted everybody to come to dinner with me, not just one person. Another aspect of variation is pigeons, okay? And pigeons are not things that fly through the air. Well, they are, but... pigeons develop when two or more languages come into contact. Typically, many of the pigeons in the Asian and Southeast Asian region developed when European explorers and traders and so on came into contact with and interacted with local communities, the Malay community, the Chinese communities in various parts of Southeast Asia and so on. The communication involves simplified grammar forms and combinations of the language in contact, all right? So a pigeon will exhibit some of the features of the local language and some of the features of the imported language. The hybrid form develops a degree of codification and becomes known as a pidgin, okay? And I've given an example here from New Guinea pidgin, and you can see how if you trace back. So I was reading some New Guinea pidgin recently. I was reading a document, okay, and the document was entitled Tok Bilog Gabman. Tok Bilog Gabman. And if you just hear that, Tok Bilog Gabman, it sounds like a foreign language, doesn't it? But then where did it come from? The words are actually have developed out of English. So tok is talk, bilog is belong, and gabman, government, okay? Talk, belong, government. And what it means is government message from the government, okay? And so you can see how the pigeon itself has evolved from English in this particular instance. And then another source of variation is what we call creoles. And creoles develop when pidgins actually become the first language. Okay, so pidgins are used, when we refer to pidgins, we're referring to language variations that are not the first language. So the people who are using them have a first language and then they use the pidgins for purposes of communication. But when those pidgins become creoles, they've actually become the first language of a group of speakers in a particular speech community or a geographical region. So a creole is a pidgin that has evolved into a language in its own right, and this usually happens over several generations. And so, as I say, I've gone into that to this explanation or description of language variation in some detail, because if we didn't have this variation, then we wouldn't be talking about standard language and language standards. The issue, one of the key issues at the moment, as I said at the beginning of the talk, is this issue: should we try and eradicate, get rid of Chinglish, Singlish, Konglish, Spanglish, and so on? Okay, and my response is no, that we shouldn't. But what we should do is to promote the use of standard varieties, internationally accepted, standardised varieties. So people can use Konglish in social situations, but we're doing our learners a disservice. We're not doing them a service, we're doing them a disservice if we don't encourage them to develop internationally acceptable standard, an internationally acceptable standard variety of English. And let's look at standard written English. It's very interesting that that standard written English only developed fairly recently with the large-scale development of print media. Even William Shakespeare spelled his own name up to 6 different ways, and I've reproduced those on the slide. I hope you can see that slide okay. But what's interesting is that none of these is the way that we actually spell his name today. Okay? So why did standardised written English evolve? Standardised written forms of the language are there to aid the reader. They're there to make the job easier for the reader. Right? They make it harder for the writer, don't they? Okay? If you could write any word you liked in a rough approximation of how it sounds, which is the way that people used to write before the development of standard written forms, it makes it quite difficult for the reader. It's a lot easier for the writer because they don't have to look up a dictionary to find out the correct way to spell a word they're not sure of, but it makes it more difficult for the reader. The standard form makes it more difficult for the writer, but makes the job of reading and obtaining meaning from reading easier for the reader. Let's then do a little bit of history and look at the spread of English. What happened? How did English spread? Well, first of all, there were 2 diasporas or 2 spreads. Okay, the first one was migration from the United Kingdom to North America, Australia, and New Zealand from the early 17th century to the early to around the 1790s, and this resulted. I was going to say this revolted. This resulted in L1 varieties of English. Okay, Canadian English, New Zealand English, Australian English, American English, and so on. Okay. In the second diaspora, this involved migration to Africa and Asia, where there were well-established, I should say that there were well-established local languages in places like Australia and North America and Canada. The local indigenous populations had their own language, but the migration of Europeans overwhelmed the locals, and there was very little leakage of indigenous languages into the local language. In the second diaspora, the migration was to Africa and Asia and the Pacific from around 1790s to the 1850s, and this resulted in L2 varieties of English, okay? Such as, for example, Singaporean English or Singlish. So it then led to a number of different ways of making sense of where English was in the world. And one of these ways was to look at Braj Kashru, the linguist who has written extensively on this subject. He talked about a number of different circles: inner, outer and expanding circle countries. And so inner circle countries were those where English was the native language: USA, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Then there were outer circle countries where English is widely used in the community, although it's not the native language of the majority of the speakers. Okay, places like Ghana, India, Kenya, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, Zambia. And then the final circle is the expanding circle countries: China, Egypt, Indonesia, Israel, Japan, Korea, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, USSR, Zimbabwe, where English, until fairly recently, would have been considered as a foreign language. Again, I'm going to question the distinction between ESL, English as a second language, and English as a foreign language. I think that with the emergence of English as a global language, I think these terms are no longer particularly useful and don't reflect in any salient way the realities of language use today. And so what is that language use today? So David Crystal, whom I'm sure many of you have heard of, makes the following statement in terms of the development of English as a global language. He says, "It all happened so quickly. In 1950, any notion of English as a true world language was but a dim, shadowy, theoretical possibility surrounded by the uncertainties of the Cold War and lacking any clear definition of a sense of direction. 50 years on, and world English exists as a political and cultural reality. How could such a dramatic linguistic shift have taken place in less than a lifetime? And why has English, and not some other language, achieved such a status?" Just to give you a snapshot of some of the ways in which English is used in different contexts around the world today, consider these little vignettes. In Latin America, KPMG, the management consulting company, KPMG Latin America, determines that English will be the official language of communication within the corporation, which means that a middle manager working in Bogota, Colombia, whose first language is Spanish, communicating with her counterpart in Buenos Aires, Argentina, who is also a first language speaker of Spanish, is required by the company to communicate through the medium of English. Salaries and promotions are tied to levels of language competence, English language competence. When an employee of that company wants to go for a promotion, then they have to demonstrate a certain degree of facility in English, and if they can demonstrate that they've improved their language proficiency, say from one IELTS band to another, then they get a salary increase. Okay, so English language competence is of crucial importance. Vignette 2, in Thailand, Chinese and Thai engineers collaborated on the construction of a dam through the medium of English. They didn't speak Chinese, they didn't communicate through Thai, they communicated through English. Vignette 3, in the Philippines, the Pope addresses the faithful in English. Not in his native German, not in Tagalog or one of the other languages of the Philippines. He used English. Vignette number 4, in southern China, a Hong Kong accounting firm carries out a company audit, collecting the data through Mandarin and Cantonese, but presenting the written report in English. In fact, this was a research project that I was involved in with my colleague Gail Forey, and we were commissioned by the Hong Kong Society of Accountants to do an ethnographic study into the patterns of language use in the accounting profession in Hong Kong and southern China. They also wanted to know what the cost was, the cost to the business world in Hong Kong and southern China of inadequate levels of English. And so that was an interesting challenge. How do you estimate, how do you figure out the cost to a company of inadequate levels of English. And why did we choose the accounting profession? Well, we chose the accounting profession because every company, regardless of what they make or what they sell, has accountants. Okay? So it gave us a kind of convenient snapshot across many different industries and so on. So the way we did it was we went into the companies and we said to them, we asked the senior partners. Now the senior partners are the very high up people in a particular accounting firm. We asked them to keep a log or a journal or a record of the number of hours a week that they spent redrafting audit reports and other documents going out. And the results astonished us. The average was something like 15 hours a week. Now, when you consider the enormous salaries that senior partners earn in Hong Kong in accounting firms, you can get a very good estimate of the cost to these companies of the inadequate levels of English. Okay? But it was also the part of the study that I've represented here was interesting as well, because it gave us a very interesting little snapshot of the complexities of language use in southern China. You've got 3 different oral languages, okay? English, Putonghua and Guangdonghua, and you've got 2 different media, spoken and written. And so the accountants who were carrying out these audits had a very, very complex linguistic challenge with these the different media and the 3 different languages. Vignette 5. In Brazil, a leading agricultural export firm hires employees who are fluent in English and trains them as accountants rather than hiring accountants and training them in English. And I did some interviews when I was in Brazil last year with a number of companies that were, with this particular company in fact, I had a contact who was able to get me into the company to chat to them. And the training, the human resources training person said, well, we've discovered that it's actually, it's more expensive and it takes longer for somebody to develop fluency in English than it does to become an accountant. So it's cheaper for us to hire people who have, through their efforts, through school and after school, it's cheaper for us to actually hire people who are already fluent in English and then train them as accountants, rather than hiring accountants and then training them in English. In Vignette 6, in Korea, several key universities mandate English as the medium of instruction in subjects such as technology and engineering. And again, this is happening throughout the Asian region. It's happening quite rapidly in China, for example. So, who uses English today? Well, I've just taken some data from one particular, and I've taken this from David Gradol's study. I've just taken one area, which is the area of tourism. Look at this. When we look at tourists using English, native speakers speaking to speakers in English-speaking countries, 4%. Okay, so Americans, for example, or Canadians going to the UK, communicating, Canadians going to Australia, Australians going to New Zealand, that accounts for 4% of language use. Native English speakers to non-English speaking countries, or to people in non-English speaking countries, 12%. Non-English speakers, such as Koreans going to the UK as tourists, non-English speakers to English speaking countries, 10%. But then look at the last one. Non-English speakers to non-English speaking countries, a whopping 74%. And again, this underlines a fact that we've known for some time, that if we go out and take a snapshot of all of the communications that are going on in English in the world right at this moment, the vast majority of them will be between non-native speakers and non-native speakers. And this is transforming the patterns of English and also the way that English is used in ways that I think we can hardly comprehend right now. I'm a great fan of Korean dramas, okay, like everybody, of course. But what I'm particularly interested in is the ways in which English is creeping in and the ways in which it's being used in Korean dramas in ways which vary from the kind of ways in which English exists in textbooks, for example. People are taking English and they're making it their own. And I would argue that this is something which is going to continue. It's going to continue. All right, let's look then at criteria for standard languages. Remember, my theme this afternoon is that we should be promoting internationally acceptable standards of English, not native speaker norms. And I'd argue that there are three important criteria: intelligibility, appropriateness, and effectiveness. And again, there are overlaps between these criteria. So intelligibility, when I was collecting the data for the Singapore, in the Singapore study, I would hear people using, saying things in Singlish, such as, "Hito kokla," okay? And I knew it was English, right? It was English syntax, some of the, and they're English words, but I didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue. "Hito kokla," no idea. But when I was talking to a friend a little while after I heard this particular utterance, she speaks standard Singaporean English, right? Standard Singaporean English. And she was going to drive me across downtown, and she said, "Oh, please wait a minute, I have to go to the office to take my keys." Okay? And I've noticed that in Singaporean English that in my dialect, I don't know about Dr. Beattie and Dr. Curtis, but in my dialect we would say I have to go to the office to get my keys. However, this was perfectly intelligible. Okay? So I would say that while the first utterance, "Hito kakla," is not standard, it's not internationally intelligible. Anybody know what it means? Well, you can actually figure it out. He talks a lot of nonsense. Okay, so you're probably thinking, "Oh, Professor Noonan, "Hito kokla." But so please wait a minute. I have to go to the office to take my keys, even though it's not the way in my dialect we would use it. To me, it's perfectly acceptable. Okay, so intelligibility. Here is a native speaker. Here's a native speaking utterance. Okay. I was in the north of England, and Andy, Professor Curtis probably knows what this means, but I was in the north of England, and I walked into a pub to get a glass of water, and there was an old gentleman sitting at the bar with his pint, and he said to me, "Put wood and all, lad. Put wood and all, lad." "What?" "Put wood and all, lad." And the publican said, "He wants you to shut the door. Put the wood in the hole." Okay. Unintelligible, native speaker, okay, but unintelligible. It was not an internationally acceptable standard variety of English, even though it was being... So the notion of native speakerness is problematic. Okay? Here's one between two people who are non-native speakers and speaking a non-standard verb. Okay, the proprietor of a coffee stand. "Hello, how are you? Long time no see. Sit. Beer you want? Coca-Cola? Don't want. Coffee have? Coffee have. $2 only. Latte? Cup? Latte, how much? Same, $2. You want to eat? French fry? No need. McDonald already breakfast. You want look-see menu? No need. Too fat already. Ay-ya." All right, so again, this is a non-standard form, but it passes the intelligibility test. All right. The next criterion measure, I think, is appropriateness. And again, here we come back to this issue that I talked about earlier, where it's important to reference the way you speak in terms of what you're saying, to whom you're speaking, and the mode, whether you're using spoken versus written, whether you're text messaging or whatever. Okay, and so these three key register variables, again, the mark to me of an educated person or of a competent user of a language is someone who can modify their language according to these different variables and take these different variables into account. And we can mix and match any of these. For example, imagine a conversation. Imagine the field, or the what of the conversation, is the buying of a birthday gift. Imagine that the tenor is a daughter to her mother, and she's having a conversation face to face over a cup of coffee, and she says, "Oh, I don't know what to buy. I don't know what to buy Dad for his birthday. I don't know what to buy Dad for his birthday." And so they have a conversation. And we could vary any of those, okay? If we kept the field the same, buying a birthday gift, but now it's a woman talking to her husband about what to buy a birthday gift for the daughter in a face-to-face situation, if you recorded that conversation, you'd find systematic differences. And then we could vary the field, planning a weekend trip, daughter to mother, face-to-face. Going back to buying a birthday gift, daughter to mother, on the telephone. Okay? Imagine the daughter is looking at a website for buying a gift online, or is looking at a catalogue, from a store. In a face-to-face situation, the woman can use lots of things like this and it, and what do you think of this one? What do you think of that one? But over the telephone, you have to be much more explicit. I remember years ago when one of my daughters was very young, and my mother lived in a city many miles, a long way away from where I did, so I would call her every Sunday night to have a chat, and I would put my little daughter on to have a chat with her grandmother, and she'd only just learned to talk, but she would say things like, "Oh, do you like this? I just got a new dress, Nana. Look at it. Look at this." She was not able to say, "I just got a new dress and it's got a nice pattern," because for her, anybody at all to whom she was talking, she assumed that they also knew what was in her field of vision. One of the characteristics of the early stages of language development is extreme egocentricity. Some of my friends have never gotten over that stage, actually, even though they're adults. And so we could go on, planning a weekend, daughter to mother, woman to husband, face-to-face, telephone, email, Skype, whatever. Effectiveness then also has to do with the different macro functions: transactional language, interpersonal language, and aesthetic language. Do you know this fellow? Jamie Oliver? So I really love watching cooking shows, and I love watching Jamie Oliver, and I was watching him one night, and he said, "Oh, these carrots are wicked. These carrots are wicked." And I thought, what are you going to do, Jamie? Beat them to death with a wooden spoon? So here are some proposals. First of all, it's crucial to promote internationally acceptable English. And we are doing our learners a disservice if we don't set this as the goal. The goal is not to speak like the Queen, okay, or the King. The goal is not to become indistinguishable from a native speaker. The goal is to develop an internationally acceptable standard of English. In fact, writing again within the Singaporean context, Gupta, she was one of the researchers who first, in the 1980s, who first described Singaporean English and described the features and characteristics of Singaporean English that she said differentiated it from other varieties of English. And she says in the 1980s the policy was that the English, and this was Singapore government policy, was that English taught in Singapore should be British Standard English with an RP accent, okay? That everybody in Singapore would speak like the Queen of England. Delivery of an RP accent, however, she goes on to say, was impossible because almost no teachers were speakers of RP. In any case, it's evident that accents of standard English are diverse, and that to impose a particular foreign accent on a population is unnecessary, unpopular, and impossible. Proposal number 2, there is a need to recognise and value a range of accents, dialects, and even pidgins and creoles for different communicative, social, and cultural purposes. And trying to stamp out Konglish or Singlish or Chinglish or Spinglish or Spanglish or Winglish or Wanglish or whatever. This is actually not going to happen and is unhelpful. And in fact, we should recognise that and acknowledge that the mark of an educated person is the mastery of a range of registers and dialects and the knowledge and ability to deploy these appropriately. And then proposal number 4, and my final point this afternoon, languages constantly change, morph, mutate, and in some cases, unfortunately, die. However, they cannot be legislated out of existence. They die when there are not enough people left around who want to keep them alive by using them. Thank you very much.
I'm Dr. Ken Beattie, and I am Canadian, and I'm very proud of it. My English is all right. Two Canadians in the audience. I'd like to talk about a few different issues today, but just before I do, I want to talk about a couple of things that Professor Noonan said. And then after I'm finished, then Professor Curtis is going to show us how intelligent he is and comment on things that both of us have said. One thing I'm really interested in is in the whole idea of language change, and a couple of things that Professor Noonan struck me. The first one was this whole idea about speaking the Queen's English. First of all, can anybody tell me, if we speak the Queen's English, what does the Queen speak? Any idea? Trick question. She speaks the King's English. Actually, that's what the Queen speaks. She's the only one. She speaks the King's English. We speak the Queen's English, if we're British. But in fact, this whole idea of received pronunciation, this perfect British accent, people do adopt it. And when I lived in Victoria, Canada, I lived there, and that's when I first started studying linguistics and studying textbooks by Professor Noonan and others. I had a very interesting professor who was an expert on accents, and he had us do an exercise. We had to go talk to people and find out where they were from, if they had a British accent. And what was really interesting is that there were people who you say, oh, excuse me, where are you from? Where am I from? Pardon me, you know, and I'd be like, and I say, yes, well, I'm just doing research on British accents. Where are you from? I'm from Leeds, yeah. And then all of a sudden the accent would change. And one of the reasons why is because when people came to Canada from all over the British Isles, they wanted to raise their status. So it wasn't just a question of, for example, Professor Noonan's mother saying, you know, don't say that, I want you to be, but people themselves often modify their accents to improve in some way, or to give the appearance of improving their social situation. Another thing that sort of struck me that was interesting was this use of la. And actually, I've heard this, in Singapore they say this la at the end of this little particle that comes at the end of a sentence, and it's often an emphasis or something. Is that what it's all about? La? Anyway, but what was really interesting to me, because I'm talking still about this idea of language change, is right now I'm reading some novels set in the 1700s. And they're using this in England, this la. So I think the la is not just, I have to do the research, but I don't think it's a new thing that's just the Singaporeans have adopted, but rather it is a vestige. It is an old part of English language that they have preserved. So that's another interesting sort of general idea. And the other one, the other bigger picture is Professor Noonan asked one question which I think he didn't answer, which had to do with this concept of, you know, why is English so popular now? Well, I can't answer that. I think there's a lot of political and social reasons. There's the pan-cultural phenomena of things like rock and roll spreading English around the world and things like that. But it hasn't always been the way. 500 years ago, if you really wanted to be an educated person and communicate in a very international fashion, you were probably doing so in Latin. A couple of hundred years ago, it would have been if you wanted to study German, you would study German because you wanted to understand science. And up until very recently, many of the leading periodicals were published in German. And who knows, maybe in 100 years, we'll all be studying Korean. Okay, let's see, yeah. But let's turn to my topic, which is fascinating. How much English is essential? I always wonder this, and as a language learner myself. So I've studied French, and Chinese. But also I'm studying Spanish now. I'm trying to improve my Spanish because I'm traveling a lot in Latin America and South America. So one of the questions that I have is how much is enough? And a lot of students ask this as well. I was in Colombia and found this delightful poster on a post outside. Now, you have to understand, I went to university for 15 years, for a long time. I've been studying English and teaching my whole life, practically, it seems. And here I go. I find the secret. It says, speak English in 4 meses. Speak English in 4 months, right? And then it says, domination of the language in 8 months, right? I thought, fantastic, with music therapy. But this is the best part. This is the best part. Sin dedicación means without any effort or dedication. And I thought, they know how to do it. But in fact, they don't. In fact, they don't. In fact, there is a lot of effort and dedication involved in learning a language. But it's an amazing thing that we haven't, as a profession, figured out the absolutely, totally best way of doing so. Or maybe we have, but it doesn't really work. In fact, what is the best way to learn a language? Probably get a boyfriend or a girlfriend who speaks fluent English, and that would probably be the most effective thing. But we talk about this idea of essential English, and we're trying to figure out what is essential. And if you look it up, this is just a Google page with a whole number of books on the topic, and you see some repeated, but essential English seems to be a very, very popular topic. And there's an idea out there that we can learn some key vocabulary, some key structures, and then that's going to be enough. It's going to be essential. It'll get us through life, or at least through our language life in some way. But what do we do by defining essential? Well, we have to ask ourselves these questions, and the bad news is the answers are going to be different for each of us. The first one is, what language would you find essential? So these are questions I'm asking you to ask yourself. Well, in each of our different contexts, it's going to be a little bit different because of our own interests and what we like to do, things we like to shop for and buy. My essential language is going to be different than that of my wife because we shop for different things. How would that language compare to what others would find essential? If you were trying to define what essential language was, if you're based in Korea, well, I mean, I don't know, you've got to learn how to say kimchi in English, I suppose. I mean, there's got to be some things in Korea that you would talk about more that you would not talk about elsewhere. This morning I did an exercise with the graduate students that we're working with, and one of the pictures was a lizard. In South America, I did this with several hundred people, and every single one of them got the answer, iguana. It was I for iguana. But I did the same thing in China. Nobody got it. It wasn't localized. So this is a key element of language. How is it localized? So we don't all need the same language, but we need a certain amount of language depending on where we live, who we are, what we do, and what we're interested in. And then there's finally the last question here. How would your teacher know that? If your teacher is supposed to be teaching you some essential English, how does she or he know that? Well, of course, one of the ways they can know that is actually by asking the students. And this leads us into the whole notion of a student-centered classroom, in which the teacher takes the time not just to assume that, hey, I know everything, I'm going to tell you, but rather, what do you know, what do you need to know, what do you want to know? Those are some of the questions. Now, Lee and Richards did a really interesting study, and they looked at some essential Cantonese books, and they were based in Hong Kong, and they tried to look at them and see what they had in common. It was learning Cantonese as a second language, and they found them largely lacking in agreement. There was almost nothing that every book agreed on in terms of the vocabulary or the grammar, the grammatical structures that were used. It's amazing. You think they're essential ones. Hong Kong is a small place. It's the only place in where Cantonese, I mean maybe Guangdong in China as well, but it's mostly the key place where it's spoken, yet 5 books on the same topic can't seem to agree on the vocabulary, can't seem to agree on the most important grammatical structures. In fact, it was a real mess, a real mess. Now that's partly the shortcomings of probably the authors and the publishers, and perhaps, but there was no standardization in terms of what they want. And my feeling is because the audiences were different. So why do many approaches fail? I mentioned this musicoterapia, music therapy on that poster, the first one. That's the only way to learn English in 4 months. But in fact, it doesn't work. Well, many approaches to language teaching and learning fail because they're not tailored to the expectations or needs of individuals or even groups of learners. So what do I mean is break this down for you. So many of the approaches when we're trying to teach somebody, we're not really starting from this point of view of the learner. What does the learner want to learn? What do they need to learn? You know, what's important to them? What's their particular context in some way? And because we don't take those into consideration, it creates problems. We have a variety of views of language, and you know, many of these have different ways of approaching the language. One of them is corpus linguistics, and that's enormously helpful because corpus linguistics tries to look at the language as it's being used. So how many people know corpus linguistics? Yeah? Okay. How many people don't know corpus linguistics? And how many people don't have any arms? Yeah? All right, okay, that's fine. Okay, just checking, that's all right. It's okay, I feel sorry for you, but that's all right. Okay, corpus linguistics, very briefly, is looking at a large body of language. We might take thousands of newspapers and other periodicals, and we put all the words together, and then we find out generalized rules from it. We see collocations, words that technically or typically go together. We see the frequency of the use of words and the context in which it's used. So we get large ideas about language. That's really a valuable linguistic tool for teaching us, I think, in some ways, of what's essential. We have the second one, a sort of situational approach to language learning, where we might look at a student and say, okay, you live in Korea, in Seoul, in a very specific neighborhood, and you do these things, and maybe that's the situations you should learn language for. Or if you're going overseas, you're going to be a tourist, you're going to be traveling to England, this, that, and the other thing. Gives you a clear idea maybe of what you need to learn. And for the last one, for tasks, which I tried to correct on the thing, but for tasks to be performed, is another way. It's sort of a task-based orientation to it, thinking, what tasks do you need to perform in this language? You know, what in English language, what tasks do you need to do? Do you need it to go shopping? Do you need it to cook things or to buy ingredients or something else? And that would start to begin to give you some essential English, if we could define that. A number of years ago, I was traveling from Hong Kong back to Beijing, where I lived for a few years, with a friend, and I said, oh, so what do you want to do when we're in Beijing? He said, oh, I want to shop for carpets, And I thought, okay. And he said, can you help me? I said, I probably can. So I speak a little bit, I speak a little bit of Chinese, but I didn't know anything about carpets. So I said, well, what do you need? So I did an analysis with him. And of course, if you're buying carpets, you need to talk about, you know, is it synthetic or is it wool? What kind of wool or silk? Is it natural dyes or artificial dyes? And how many knots per inch? And so I tried to learn all those words. And in fact, we were successful in trying to buy some rugs. So that was good, right? Okay. One of the questions that concerns me about essential English and the whole concept of essential English is that, okay, so when do I know it's enough? When do I know it's enough? Well, in fact, learning English is not like riding a bicycle. Riding a bicycle, you get on the bicycle, you ride, you fall down, get back on, try it again. Maybe you fall down 2 or 3 times. But if you do not ride a bicycle for 20 years, you can probably still get back on the bicycle and ride it. If you learn a language or part of a language or some bits of language and you do not use them for 20 years, you probably will not be able to get on that language bicycle again and ride it, right? So you need to keep doing it. So, but what I find is that many people stop, and where do they stop is what interests me. Now, in many languages, you learn basic things. So in Spanish, I say no lo conozco. In French, je ne sais pas, I don't know, right? Bujudao in Chinese, I don't know. That's a very sort of basic plateau, and it's sort of a protective sort of explanation that you would give when somebody starts talking too quickly or saying too much to you. We get to other plateaus, though, and there are other plateaus to which we can go, and to which, as teachers, we can take our students. And I think the plateaus that I'd like to see everybody moving towards are those which allow them to become self-directed learners. And how do we do that? Well, there's some simple phrases that we can begin teaching students. what's the name for this? You know, Shumshajega. You know, what is that? You know, what is that? Then you can learn the language. If you learn vocabulary around what's the difference between this and this, or how do you spell this, or you know, is this the same as this, right? So there's a number of very simple sort of language things in plateaus where we could at least take them there so that they can get to the next plateau and continue to acquire vocabulary and structures on their own. So something that would allow them to learn. So I think that that's sort of an important idea. We can't really ever stop. We can't stop learning. And we have to keep going past these plateaus. Just don't give up, right? Okay, thank you.
I am Dr. Andy Curtis, and if Professor Ken Beattie is the other guy after Professor Noonan, then I would be the other guy. And whilst Professor Noonan is a proud Australian and Professor Beattie is a proud Canadian, I am British and not proud of that. I think, do we have anyone from England here?
Not anymore.
Good, because one of the things I get into trouble with, and I've written papers and presented on this, is aspects of language and culture and humour. And there are not many things I miss about not living in England. When people ask me, what do you miss about living in England, I'll say things, oh, well, the food and the weather, and see how carefully they're paying attention, because British humour is quite different. Can anybody tell me how you can recognise British humour versus other kinds of humour, Australian or Canadian or Korean humour? What are some of the things that mark linguistically British humour as different from other kinds of humour? Right, British humour is distinctive because it's not funny. It's ironic or self-deprecating, but it's often not what you'd call funny. So if I am funny, then it will only be by accident, and please accept my apologies in advance. My role this evening is my great honour to briefly summarise some of the main points of the two previous speakers, to briefly highlight the relationships between the speakers, and then if we have time to take a few questions at the end. So one of the first points that both Professor Noonan and Professor Beattie referred to is the notion of prescriptive versus descriptive approaches, which is still a recurring debate in our field. Our field often is moving along this continuum from prescriptive approaches where you say how people should use English, and Professor Noonan presented many examples of native speakers not using the language as they should, versus how people actually use the language, descriptive approaches, and Professor Beattie referred to corpus linguistics, so prescriptive versus descriptive features. The other point, the second point, was language and identity. The relationship between language and culture and identity really wasn't fully recognised for the first century or so of language teaching. And there was a lovely study done a few years ago of British speakers, speakers of British English, who were learning French and Spanish. And they got to these very high levels of fluency, but they kept making interesting mistakes in their French and their Spanish. And so they took a very traditional experimental approach, measured their French and Spanish and taught them, and then measured them again. And they were well educated and near native. And eventually somebody thought to ask them why they were doing this. Why, even though their French was excellent, they kept making some mistakes. And their Spanish was excellent. Do you know why they kept making those mistakes? Because they were British and they didn't want to be mistaken for French or Spanish people. They wanted to be known as well-educated Brits who spoke French very well but were not French, or who spoke Spanish very well but were not Spanish. Now, one of my forays into language learning has been to attempt to learn Esperanto. Does anyone know Esperanto? It's this perfect language that nobody speaks. Shakespearean plays have been translated into Esperanto. Some of the world's great literature has been translated into Esperanto. Nobody uses it. Why not? Because there is no identity. There is no cultural identity associated with Esperanto. So this point of language and identity is very important. The third point was about mutual intelligibility. For many years our field looked at accuracy and correctness, and there are still many schools of language teaching where accuracy and correctness are the main goals. But these days, as Professor Noonan and Professor Beattie pointed out, we're looking at mutual intelligibility and appropriateness. If most of the people involved in the language interaction understand most of what they are saying or writing, then it's mutually intelligible. Whether it's accurate and correct by some native speaker norms is becoming less and less important. So moving away from accuracy and correctness towards mutual intelligibility and appropriateness. A fourth point was the notion of the ownership of English, which used to be, as Professor Noonan said, the inner circle countries. And the ownership of English has been extremely important in our field because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it used to be owned by certain selective shareholders, and now it's become a global commodity. The next point was this move from English as a foreign language and English as a second language to ELF, from ESL and EFL to ELF. Are people familiar with the notion of ELF? English as a lingua franca, and a major publisher is just producing the first volume of a new journal called English as a lingua franca. English as a world language, rather than whether it's a second or a foreign or an additional language. So English as a lingua franca is going to be the next big thing in our field, as it has been for some years. The sixth point is a more delicate one because it was related to the notion of native speakers of a language. And as some of my students said recently, native speakers of English are an endangered species. Now, I don't know if they're an endangered species, but what's becoming clear is that the world has less and less use for monolingual speakers. They're just not that useful anymore, even if they speak the dominant language. If they only speak that, it actually doesn't matter how well they speak it, because they don't know anything else. So the world has less and less use for monolingual speakers, whatever that one language that they have is. And native speaker norms are becoming less and less relevant. The seventh point, which is something I was talking about with our Anaheim University MA TESOL graduates this morning, was my background is in medical science. And so, as Professor Noonan alluded to, language is very much a living, breathing entity. And like all organic entities, it's born, it reproduces, it has all of the characteristics of a living thing, including language death, as he pointed out. The eighth point, there's only a couple more, were on the relationship between English as a world language and political, historical, social and economic reasons. You notice none of them are linguistic. Political, social, economic and historical, not linguistic. There's actually nothing inherently special or better about English that makes it a world language, which is one reason why it won't always be a world language. It became a world language because after the Second World War, the Americans won. If the Germans had won, it would have been a different story. So as the English-speaking economies of the world decline, and as Asian economies, Indian economies and Chinese economies thrive, within our lifetime, we're going to see a very major shift in what constitutes a global language. And the ninth point was the best way to learn a language. We've talked about this a lot, Professor Noonan, Professor Beattie and myself, and we're pretty much agreed that there are many methods in the field, but the best way that we've come across is to fall in love with a native speaker of the target language. As far as we know, that's the definitive information gap activity. And moving quickly on to the 10th and final point made by Professor Beattie, which is this importance of learner autonomy, self-directed learning and independent language learning. So those were the 10 main points from the two previous talks from our distinguished speakers, and we'll now have a couple of minutes to take a couple of brief questions. Thank you.